I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to this special edition of the Sky News Daily podcast, where we're going to be looking back at 2023 through the prism of economics, the numbers, the data, the cash in your pocket. Times, well, they are certainly tough right now. Indeed, they have been that way for longer than any of us would care to remember. But are we looking towards the future with optimism? Or are we scrabbling around down the back of the nation's sofa looking for some spare change? Someone not short of the answers, and indeed not short of a bob or two, our economics and data editor, Ed Conway.
If only.
Nice.
If only.
Nice to see you, Ed. Look,
nice to see you.
I suppose the easiest way to start this is looking back on the year. Starting at the very beginning, 2022 was pretty rough.
Yeah.
We had Liz Truss, we had Kwasi Kwarteng, we had the mini budget, we had all the ructions in the economy. 2023, Rishi Sunak and his Chancellor Jeremy Hunt were supposed to steady the ship, did they?
Yeah, and it was supposed to be more boring, and from our perspective, which I think people would think would be no bad thing after what happened in 2022. And yeah, it kind of has been more boring. I mean, there's certainly big economic forces going on right now that are not boring and that are very tough, particularly cost of living, and we can talk more about that because while it was headline news before, 2022, as well as being Liz Truss, let's not forget, one of the things she did when she was in office that wasn't kind of pulled back was the energy price guarantee. It was a massive issue then, and we were kind of wrestling with what was happening. But these things kind of don't go away. And so for a lot of people, cost of living, it's just been this squeeze that's continued, even though the annual rate of inflation's gone down. So not boring from that perspective, but, the stuff that Jeremy Hunt has wanted to do, steadying the ship, it's fair to say in comparison with what was happening previously, he certainly has done. The problem, though, is I was just looking back at the numbers, and basically, the economy has just been flat. It's been this eerily flat line. It hasn't really grown much at all over the past year.
But we didn't go into recession, though, did we?
No.
And I don't like to remind people of things that they said, this time last year. But you were one of those who were concerned that we could be going into...
Did I say did I say recession?
Even perhaps not as deep as it perhaps wouldn't be a deep recession, but you were certainly concerned about it.
Thank you for calling me up.
But how did you do that?
No, I mean, that's like it looked pretty bleak after what happened last year. I think particularly it wasn't just what happened with the mini budget. It was just that we as a nation were and are facing this massive kind of cost of living adjustment where suddenly everything, energy kind of goes into everything. Suddenly everything was more expensive, and so we were poorer as a result. We haven't gone into recession, so I was wrong on that. But it has basically been kind of just nothing. It's been, you normally expect the economy to grow at maybe like 0.5, 0.7% a quarter. Well, over the last year, it's grown at about 0.5% for the whole year. So, you're talking about kind of like a quarter of the performance you might have normally expected. And what does that mean in practice? It means that, we're not seeing our living standards improving. So while it's not technically a recession, so wrong, Conway wrong, in practice, in terms of like how it feels, I think it has felt for a lot of people like a recession. It's felt like a really tough period.
Particularly.
And still does.
Yeah, of course, and particularly when you add on top of that the inflation figures that we've been seeing.
Inflation and interest rates as well on top of that.
Go. But have we perhaps turned the corner on both of those things?
Well, I think that's the good question because, yes, definitely on inflation, yes, that it is now down and it is probably going to continue going down. And the Chancellor, Prime Minister have met their target pledge, whatever it was at the start of the year, of trying to halve inflation. I mean, how much they had to do with that is a good question. The answer, by the way, is kind of nothing. But even so, or maybe like at the margin, it kind of helped. But it's the Bank of England's job to try and bring inflation down. They've done so by raising interest rates really high to 5.25%. I don't think even at the start of it, that's probably another thing I would have got wrong. I didn't expect it to go quite as high as that.
Well, precious few did.
But I think the interesting question now, I mean, we're talking mostly about the year that's been, but now those interest rates are at kind of 5.25%. That's really tough for a lot of households. It's tough in a kind of isolated way. So if you've got a mortgage and you're looking to refix, that's a tough kind of shift you're going through. And we're all seeing that with homeowners across the country. But for other people, it's not that tough. If you've got savings, actually, it's pretty good time. You're seeing interest rates. You're seeing it on your savings for the first time in ages. The question now is how quickly the Bank of England lets those go down. And that, again, is an open question. Most economists think it's going to kind of come down towards the middle of next year, maybe even as soon as the spring. But the bank, you talk to the bank and they're like, it's not coming down anytime soon. So there's a bit of expectation management going on.
But what of the Conservatives and their claim to have, over this year, taken some pretty dramatic action on taxation? I mean, you know, the days of calling the Conservatives the party of low tax, I would gently submit, might be over, at least for this parliament.
Oh, it's gone. I mean, it's, look at the data. It's straightforward. The tax burden is now rising to the highest level that it's been in the post-war period.
I thought they'd taken the biggest tax-cutting measure, in living memory.
No, it's just, it's kind of phraseology. I mean, well, yes, technically speaking, what you saw imposed in the autumn statement were some big tax cuts, but they followed some very big tax increases the previous time around. So if you kind of even it all out in net terms, taxes are much higher than they were before, much, much higher. And partly that's because of inflation, because the nature of those tax increases we saw before, it ratchets, more and more people. It's not like the rates going higher, but more and more people get grabbed into those higher rates of taxation, fiscal drag they call it. And the upshot is we're all paying more tax as a result across the country, more than we have done for decades. But I think there is a kind of legitimate question as to, would any party have been able to change that? If you look across Europe, to some extent the US, but certainly across Europe, everyone is seeing their tax burden go up. So you're seeing what they call secular demographic trends there.
But I suppose the kind of the complicating factor in this country is, as well as seeing the tax take going up and the pressure on our finances, the pressure being felt through our finances in that fashion, we've also seen the biggest drop in living standards over the course of a parliament.
And
well, the
kind of
quality
related.
of life, the quality of life for an awful lot of people right now, because of rising energy costs, rising food costs, so on and so forth, is pretty grim.
Totally, and that goes back to that point, that, in a way we saw this coming kind of this time last year, when energy is kind of a proportion, maybe 40% of everything, everything we do. If that 40% has just gone up enormously and you're not actually producing most of the energy because it's coming in from Russia or somewhere else, then we are poorer as a result. Now, that's not everything, but it is a large part of the explanation for why everyone's feeling so much worse off. There's other things, we can talk about in due course about where the UK isn't doing very well. But basically, it is a massive tax on the nation, and we're all feeling it. And yes, it hasn't manifested as a kind of technical recession, but it's manifested as a big fall in living standards. And that fall in living standards was happening last year. It's still happening this year, and it's potentially going to happen next year as well. Less bad than it looked for a while, but it's still it's really tough. I think people are right to feel frustrated and aggrieved by this, because we haven't seen anything like this for decades.
I mean, I think everyone will have moments that they can speak to that they kind of gives their own personal experience. But I remember the first time I wandered into a shop this year and they ended up paying £5.75, I think it was, for a tub of butter. Right, we will not mention brand names here.
That's got to be a good butter.
So it wasn't quite as good as £5.75. I tell you that much. Honestly, I know I'm even getting more Scottish as I'm saying this here. But if we have a situation where there have been drops in the wholesale costs that companies have been that companies have been experiencing, but as Sky Journalism this year has shown, those savings have not always been passed on to the consumer. Particularly, I think the one that seemed most egregious to me was in terms of baby formula.
Yeah, it is egregious, and there's a lot of the time there's no excusing it. These things, you see companies trying to kind of make margin. Now, if you take a step back across the whole piece, there's been loads of research about whether there's what's called greedflation. Some economists call it greedflation. So are companies just trying to kind of make extra money, trying to make the most of this inflationary spike and get a bit of extra margin out of it? It doesn't look actually across the economy like that as a massive problem. Okay, so maybe you're seeing isolated cases where people are trying to have an opportunity and make the most of it. And in some cases, it is kind of egregious. But broadly speaking, everyone's costs have gone up. We're kind of still adjusting to this world where some of their costs are kind of evening out. The tricky thing about inflation, is that when we talk about inflation, it's a rate, So it's the rate at which prices are going up each year. That's what we typically look at. The rate has gone down. The overall level is still much higher than it was a year ago. The overall level of gas prices much higher than it was a couple of years ago. And so it's that shift from a couple of years ago to now. We are still in this other world, the kind of Putin-Ukraine world. We're in this other world where everything is more expensive. And as a result of that, it's all feeding through into our pockets, and some unfair stuff is happening along the way. But unfortunately, we're kind of taking this miserable medicine.
Just in terms of international comparisons, though, how has the UK been performing? Because you can pick and choose your set of data. And the reason I ask this, look across the Atlantic at the United States. Joe Biden's chances of having a second term are diminishing because of the way the economy is going there.
Yeah.
2023, we saw China going into deflation as well.
By comparison, though, actually, so the US is doing better than the UK. The UK is maybe doing a little bit better than much of mainland Europe. So look at what we're going through at the moment. In Germany, it's worse. They've had a recession in Germany. They're deindustrializing in Germany faster than we have. Their economic model was far more reliant on cheap Russian gas than ours was. So you're seeing some of the same things, but multiplied in Germany, and a similar story across much of Europe. China as well. I mean, it's post-COVID. People thought that China might bounce back far faster than it has, and it hasn't really. And that's the concern, is no one's quite sure kind of where the engine room for the global economy is right now. It used to be that you could rely on China when things went wrong, and that's what happened in 2008. Doesn't seem like that anymore, and that's making everyone a bit nervy.
What's been the effect on the global economy of what we've been seeing most recently? Of course, the Ukraine conflict now predates, even 2023. But the violence that we've been seeing in and around the Middle East.
So far, I mean, it's been much less marked than we saw in Russia, in Ukraine, just because Russia is one of the world's biggest producers of natural gas. Israel produces a bit of gas. There's gas actually off the coast of Gaza as well. Not all that much, but nonetheless some. But it's not like these are areas that provide a lot of our energy. And because it's not yet clear whether Iran's going to kind of like tip into this in the way that some people feared, you're not seeing those energy prices going up so much. Of course, it doesn't negate, the severity of what's happening there. But also it's a reminder, what's happening right now in Ukraine, still now, kind of years on, ultimately almost, is a massive deal for Ukrainians, for Russians, obviously, as well. But for the global economy, we are still seeing the effects of that right now. And those effects are greater for the time being, touch wood, than what we're seeing in Israel, leaving aside the human consequences.
A question that I have struggled with over the course of this year, maybe you have an answer to it. Does this government still want the United Kingdom to be, as they have stated on many occasions, to be a high-skill, high-wage economy? And the reason that I ask, and you'll already know this, of course, is that, relatively recently, in 2023, we discovered the net migration figure to this country was 750,000.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary number. And actually, I kind of looked at that number to try and get some historical context on it, just because, is this unusual? When you adjust for population, that is the highest that we have ever seen. Even going back hundreds of years, it is higher than anything we've seen in any previous period, peace or war. So people are right to be kind of disturbed by it, I guess, because this is unprecedented. And whether it kind of prefigures a big change in social or economic outcomes, I just don't think we know yet. Because a lot of these numbers are students. So these are people who theoretically might go back to where they originated from after they've done their studies. But we don't know, because the nature of our immigration system has just changed very dramatically. Post-Brexit, new rules have come in, and they have made it much more easy, particularly for students, to come in, to stay for a bit longer, potentially to have some of their dependents with them. And add on to that the kind of economic stuff that's going on at the moment. So there's concern that some of the workforce, that basically not enough people are working in the UK. So a lot of people are coming for work as well. So it's partly students. It's partly people going in to work, and mostly actually in the health service. So, were it not for this large number in immigration, our health service wouldn't necessarily be able to function. But actually, it's only a slice of it. The thing that I was surprised about when I kind of broke down the numbers, I thought that most of it was going to be explained by Ukraine and Hong Kong, because obviously you've had big immigration from people who needed to come from those areas. That only was a relatively... It was sizable, but it was, compared with the rest of it, it was relatively small. So, yeah, these are big numbers, and I just don't think... I don't think the government was expecting them to be quite as big as they actually were in the end.
But as you say, I mean, people are generally, under these schemes that we're talking about, coming here to work. I mean, is this just a natural consequence of us not being able to recruit directly from the continent?
Well, we've swapped relatively high levels of European EU immigration. Now, when you look at EU kind of citizens, they are leaving the UK in net terms. We've swapped that with immigration primarily from places like India, some parts of Africa as well, China as well. So it's a swap. And also, by the way, UK people. So what was another interesting kind of nuance is that it used to be that UK people, there was kind of emigration in British-born people. They would kind of go overseas. A lot of them going to Europe, most people going to Europe because we were all part of a single market. That's now reversed. So a lot of people who, I guess, hitherto might have gone over to Europe are not going. They're staying at home.
But in a sense, haven't we kind of put the cart before the horse? I mean, we're turning off the taps in terms of people coming to this country to work. We have an awful lot of people in this country, and this goes to productivity and so on, but we have an awful lot of people out of work at the moment and seemingly never, a lot of them seemingly never coming back. You know, if the idea is, you know, British people can do these jobs, well, we're not there yet. We're not going to be there for ages.
No, but so far the evidence is that it's proving really difficult to get people, to persuade people to come back into work. You know, British-born people, a lot of whom left the workforce during COVID, a lot of people just haven't come back. Some because they're long-term sick, some because they don't want to. Mostly it's kind of long-term sick. But there's been this massive shift. And this is, you know, the big problem facing Jeremy Hunt, Rishi Sunak, or one of them, is that trying to get the workforce back up is a big part behind trying to get the economy going again. And they haven't been able to do that yet. But like more broadly, if you take a step back, I think the issue is like, you know, we voted for Brexit as a country. No one was entirely agreed on what Brexit meant. We spent years kind of debating whether you were going to have a kind of hard Brexit or a soft Brexit. But again, not really fundamentally asking the question about what it actually meant. Does it mean more openness to immigration? Does it mean more closed borders? In the end, we have opted for more openness to immigration. But again, it's not clear whether that was what people wanted when they voted for it. But we're starting to see kind of what economists would call revealed preference. So there's revealed preference of the UK as openness, allowing many people to come in. And now you have the revealed preference of, well, they're trying to legislate in Parliament to try and prevent people from coming in. To me, it looks like we still haven't worked out as a nation what kind of economy, what kind of society we actually want, which is kind of disappointing given how long we've agonised over this and how much noise there's been, that we don't know where we want to head right now.
But is there the opportunity for us to know that if there is not a national conversation, or at least a conversation led by politicians who are open and honest about the pros and indeed, yes, the cons of migration to this country? I don't think we've seen it. I certainly don't think we've seen it since 2010.
Not yet. No, not yet. But you know, when you look at a lot of the polling, when you talk to people around the UK, they actually have a very mature attitude towards immigration. You know, a lot of people actually understand, you know, some people understandably are concerned about jobs being kind of taken by those from overseas and want that opportunity. But many people also see that we need workers to be able to do certain jobs that we have a shortfall in terms of availability of work for. And people are not per se, for the most part, against migration. In fact, when you look at polling, actually, most people are kind of in favour of it, particularly if it helps the economy. The issue, like you say, is that we just haven't had a kind of very grown-up debate about this. And it's like with everything. I mean, maybe that's just maybe perennially economics people bemoan the fact there's no kind of grown-up debate about any of this stuff. So, but it definitely feels like it with migration. It definitely feels like it with Brexit. You know, what kind of a Brexit do we want? We still don't really entirely know. Same thing with migration. Same thing with a lot of economic management.
Well, let's conclude, shall we, by talking about Brexit. I know it's your favourite topic, Ed. But
it's my least favourite topic. I find it a bit boring.
Sorry, what? Sorry, no. Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, suggesting that Brexit is boring. In what sense? No, well, I'm interested. I'm fascinated by this.
Think about what the EU does. You know, fundamentally, this is boring stuff. It's boring stuff. It's regulation. It's trade agreements. No one much cares. I do. I do, okay.
Yes, you do.
I care about trade agreements. I care about rules of origin. I care about regulation on product standards and all of these things. But fundamentally, it's not massively life-changing in the way that most of the stuff that this government decides. It's not massively life-changing in the way that so many of the other bits of economic policy are. And so, you know, the fundamentals of what we can do now that we couldn't do before are not massively shifted from where they are. But I wish that we'd at least start talking about it in a mature way, because at the moment, you know, we just we just haven't. So I get bored both by the nature of the debate, but also by this kind of idea that Brexit is responsible for everything, whether it's the end of the world or indeed kind of changing the economic model. So we're Singapore on Thames.
Exactly.
Neither is true.
But again, I think I agree with you to the extent that I think the debate, such as it is reductive. You will have people taking one of two positions. One, the Brexit brakes are on. We can't recruit to this country. We can't get the growth and productivity we need because we don't have the access that we used to. On the other hand, there are those who say, well, look at the inward investment that we are still getting. South Korea, Nissan,
Yeah.
Nissan investing heavily in the north. Why would they do that if the Brexit brakes were on?
Yeah, but that's because it is mostly a kind of a false debate. I think talk to people in business and they will say, yes, there is a factor here, which is that you've scattered some extra sand in the friction, in the wheels of industry, so there's that extra friction. So they will bemoan that, but they'll say, in the grand scheme of things, there's other things on my priority list that come up a little bit higher than that, but it's annoying, and wouldn't it be better if we had a kind of arrangement that had less friction? Most business people, particularly international trading business people, would say that. But it's not at the top. It's never been at the top. And it's never been the most important thing. And that's why I think it is kind of boring, because the stuff that Brexit actually should be able to deal with is really kind of minor in the grand scheme of things. And I think we should kind of grow up and start talking about something else, because our fundamental issues in this economy that are holding us back, that's not about Brexit. It's about whether we're able to grow. It's about whether we're able to, create opportunity. It's about whether we're able to kind of, create businesses. It's about whether we're able to sort out the health service. Like, none of that stuff is going to be affected by Brexit. Brexit, to me, just seems like a convenient excuse, both for pro-Brexiteers and anti-Brexiteers to go on about Brexit, so they can ignore the much more tricky, kind of, chewy things that we need to concentrate on. That's my personal opinion from years of having to cover this and get a bit frustrated by it. But it's nice to be able to say, oh, it's all Brexit, for better or for worse. But it's not true if we're being kind of honest with ourselves, I don't think.
Fingers crossed, Ed, that come 2024, you will never have to utter the word Brexit again.
I didn't need to rant. I'm sorry to rant.
We enjoyed it. Ed Conway, great to have you back. Thanks very much, mate.
Thank you.
And that is your lot for this very special edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.